Rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion feasts for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, Muse. When the two first broken clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. What god drove them to fight with such a fury? Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto. Incensed at the king, he swept a fatal plague through the army. Men were dying, and all because Agamemnon spurned Apollo's priest. Yes, Chryses approached the Achaeans' fast ships to win his daughter back, bringing a priceless ransom, and bearing high in hand, wound on a golden staff, the wreaths of the god, the distant deadly archer. He begged the whole Achaean army, but most of all the two supreme commanders, Atreus' two sons. Agamemnon, Menelaus, all Argives geared for war, may the gods who hold the halls of Olympus give you Priam's city to plunder. Then, safe passage home. Just set my daughter free, my dear one. Here, accept these gifts, this ransom. Honor the god who strikes from worlds away, the son of Zeus, Apollo. And all ranks of Achaeans cried out their assent. Respect the priest, accept the shining ransom. But it brought no joy to the heart of Agamemnon. The king dismissed the priest with a brutal order ringing in his ears. Never again, old man. Let me catch sight of you by the hollow ships, not loitering now nor slinking back tomorrow. The staff and the wreaths of God will never save you then. The girl, I won't give up the girl. Long before that, old age will overtake her in my house, in Argos. Far from her fatherland, slaving back and forth at the loom, forced to share my bed. Now go! Don't tempt my wrath, and you may depart alive. That, of course, is from the opening of the Iliad by Homer. Homer, the great Greek who wrote, or I should say, who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two foundational works of ancient Greek literature. And welcome, my friends, welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where we're going to talk about Homer today, and we ought to talk about Homer because Homer is pretty darn important. I have mentioned Homer before on the Sunday Penguin, but we're going to talk a little bit more about Homer because I have a series that I'm doing on ancient penguins, a whole series on ancient penguins. I'm mostly going to be concentrating in the near future on ancient historians, and then we'll move on at a later date to some ancient poetry and ancient plays. But we have to start with Homer because Homer is the foundational figure in Greek literature. Homer, who lived and composed at some point in the late 8th or early 7th centuries BC. We're not exactly sure when. Now, these epic poems were composed orally. They were oral poems. And they were not written down until later. We do not know when they were first written down. There are many guesses, which range anywhere from the late 8th to the 6th centuries BC. That's a pretty big span of time and kind of shows you how little we actually know about the composition of these epic poems. The ancient Greeks attributed both of these ancient poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, to Homer. Some ancient Greeks attributed other works as well. Nowadays, modern scholars generally agree that these two works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed by the same person. There is some dissent. There's not 100% agreement on that. But overall, in modern scholarship, these are attributed to the same person, just as they were in ancient times. But we don't know that for sure. There's an awful lot we don't know about these two ancient poems. There's a lot we do know, but a lot we don't. Now, Homer himself, as an author who was composing these poems orally, we don't know an awful lot about Homer. In fact, we know actually nothing. There's a lot of things that are said about Homer, a lot of traditions about Homer that come from the ancient Greeks. But even the ancient Greeks didn't know a heck of a lot about Homer, or they don't seem to have known a heck of a lot. He is commonly thought to have been blind. That is a story that was told in ancient Greece. But here's the thing about the ancient Greeks. They're just like everybody else. If they didn't know something, they made stuff up. And so a lot of the things that we think of when we think of Homer could just be stuff that was made up. I mean, Homer, was he the son of a river and a nymph? Probably not. That's just my guess, but you know, those were stories that were running around. But usually people thought that he was an oral poet who was blind, who composed these two epics of ancient Greek poetry. And they're pretty darn important. So we've got the editions that I have, that I'm holding up here, are the Fagles translations, the Robert Fagles verse translations, which were a pretty big deal. And I'm surprised at how long ago these were published. This was published in 1990, which is shocking to me because I remember buying this new. This is, this is the first hardback edition. I believe it's the first hardback edition of this. And then this came out in 96, The Odyssey. Both really brilliant translations. Of course, there are so many translations of these. But these are my favorites, probably. The Fagles translations, they're great translations. They're very readable. And this has a brilliant introduction, which gives you a lot of information about the poems themselves, their likely composition, how they were composed, how a person could remember a poem this long, and how they would perform these poems. And that's all really interesting information, and that makes these editions pretty cool. Now you will see that this is not a Penguin edition, but these translations became the Penguin edition of Homer. Before that, they had the Iliad translations of Homer, which were the Odyssey was the first Penguin classic, but they were superseded by these. You can still get the E.V. Rue translations, which were prose translations, and I do recommend those. If you're interested in reading the Odyssey, but maybe do not want to read a verse translation, maybe that's something you don't want to do. And in fact, the E.V. Rue translation was the first translation that I read, and they're really good. I think they're probably underrated. This is better, probably. Again, as a translation, I highly recommend them. The Iliad tells the story of the rage of Achilles, who gets all pissed off at Agamemnon and he won't fight. The Trojans, all the Greeks have their ships lined up and they're all fighting Troy. They've been fighting Troy forever. This is the famous Trojan War. And this story is only a small part of the Trojan War. There were a lot of myths and legends surrounding the Trojan War, and this is just a little bit of it about Achilles, about how Achilles got pissed off at Agamemnon and wouldn't fight, and he sat around by his ship and sulked while the Trojans were kicking the Greeks' asses. And then finally, when his best friend was killed by the Trojans, finally he said, you know what, I'll fight now. And then he fought the Trojans, and he fought Hector, the great Trojan warrior, and he had a showdown with Hector. It was truly epic, and as a poem of war, it's great. It's exceedingly violent, which I appreciated when I first read this as a little kid. I think of the two poems, this is the better one, but many people prefer the Odyssey. The Odyssey, the tales of the wanderings of Odysseus as he's trying to get home from the Trojan War, and boy does he have trouble. He's got to deal with storms and shipwreck and monsters and sorceresses and gods and goddesses. I mean, everything is standing in this guy's way trying to get home, and meanwhile, back home, his wife has to deal with a bunch of disreputable guys who want to marry her, and how her son has to deal with all this and how he's kind of overmatched. Man, Odysseus can't get home soon enough, but he takes his time getting home. It takes him a long time to get home before we have a violent ending to this poem. Again, this, because of all of the action-adventure elements and all the mythological elements that you'll find in the Odyssey, this is probably still the most popular one, although, like I said, I probably prefer the Iliad. Although this is great as well. And both of these, as I said, are very important in ancient Greek history. Because, as I said, they are foundational. When you read Herodotus or Thucydides or a lot of the ancient Greek historians, they will talk about Homer. There was not universal agreement about Homer and the historicity of these poems. Even now, was there even a Trojan War? We don't know. There's an awful lot that we don't know, unfortunately. Now, Troy was discovered in Turkey in 1873. I had to glance down at my notes. So the city of Troy does exist in Turkey. Does that mean that there was a Trojan War between the Greeks and the Trojans? There is evidence of war in Troy, in the city of Troy, in that there were sections of Troy that were burned and other signs of conflict, but does that mean there was a Trojan War? Maybe. We don't know. We really don't know, because outside of these poems, we don't have a heck of a lot of information about it. In fact, we have pretty much nothing. So all we know is that Troy existed, and there could have been a Trojan War. Now, there are an awful lot of mythological elements in the Iliad. You have gods taking part in the action. You have all of these mythological figures. We have what amounts to just plain magic. So, of course, all of that is made up. But whether it's based on anything true at all, we don't know. Annoyingly, you will still find in certain texts references to the Trojan War as if it actually happened, when we don't know if it did or not. Just know that going in. There's an awful lot we don't know about this particular time in ancient history. And these poems are interesting because they were composed probably over a period of time. Homer was whoever Homer was. And there is debate, like I said, there's a lot of debate on Homer. Even whether Homer was a man or a woman, there's even that debate. But, you know, we can't know. But he was almost certainly working from existing legends and existing myths and tying a lot of those together in his work, which covered actually a period of history. You will find elements from different times in the Iliad. They mention bronze weapons, for example, but they also mention some things that happened or some items that existed before the Bronze Age and after the Bronze Age. So it's like an amalgamation of different times and different stories. And when Homer was performing these poems, it's likely that he didn't perform them rote word for word, and you'll get more information on that kind of thing in the introduction to this volume, which is very valuable. And I do highly suggest you read these just because they are so foundational. If you're interested in literature at all, you don't have to just be interested in ancient history or ancient literature. If you just have an interest in literature, classic literature, these are essential. They really are. The Iliad and the Odyssey. And I will shut up now. I've probably said all I need to say about Homer at this particular time. Catch me next week for next week's Sunday Penguin, when we are going to be talking more about Herodotus, because, you know, I always have a lot to say about that guy. Okay, I will catch you next time.